If genocide means anything at all, what it means is something like the intentional attempt to destroy a hated group for prejudicial reasons. Israel has no such intent. There is something that Israel wants to destroy Hamas.
There are military justifications for that, given that Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population, is not surrendering, and has expressed a genocidal intent against Israel, and you need to eliminate the threat. Claims to the effect that Israel is committing genocide, initially uncommon at the beginning of Israel's war against Hamas that began on October 7th of 2023, are now commonplace. All across social media, in claims made by pundits and podcasters, in academia, in major news organizations, and even by international institutions. But is this a valid claim, and how should we evaluate it? Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Tristan Liège, postdoctoral fellow, and with me is Ben Bayer, fellow. Hey, Ben.
Hi, Tristan.
So let's begin by establishing some context. Israel has been effectively engaged in war with Arabs in some form since its founding in 1948, with varying levels of participation by Arab states. And in that time, during which Israel has been invaded several times, claims of genocide have actually been made, claims that Israel is committing genocide. But most of these claims were on the fringes of academia or by Arab leaders themselves. So, for example, Ilan Pappé, an academic, claimed during the 2014 Gaza war, which is actually somewhat recent, that Israel was acting genocidally. And then previously in the past, leaders like Nasser of Egypt, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, Gaddafi, King Hussein of Jordan, etc. Arab leaders have at various times during some of these wars, for example, the 67 war, the 1973 war, claimed that Israel is acting genocidally. So these claims are not entirely new, but the level of prominence and the popularity of this claim, in the sense of just how utterly widespread it is totally unprecedented, and also growing. So obviously, I think one of the turning points that a lot of people would point to is South Africa bringing this claim to the International Criminal Court, which certainly was taken by many people to give it a kind of respectability by bringing it into the context of international law. But, you know, foreign leaders of in Europe, in South America, the president of Brazil, all across social media, academics, op-eds everywhere in major news organizations have made this claim very widespread. So that's one reason it matters, is that this is really widespread, and it's worth thinking about, like, what does this mean and how should we evaluate it? And partly one thing that I was motivated by in thinking about this was that when people hear the term genocide and they use the term genocide, what it brings to mind, what it activates, is the images of the Holocaust, and also other paradigmatic cases of genocide, but certainly the Holocaust as the most paradigmatic case, and as we'll see when we talk about it, was certainly crucial to the coining of the term and the history of the term itself as it was created by Raphael Lemkin. And I think that raises the stakes of, like, how we should evaluate this, because, and people are explicitly saying this, that one way to think about what's happening is that Israel is inflicting something that the Jews experience themselves onto a new group of people. So in insofar as we believe the Holocaust is one of the most terrible events and terrible acts of evil that has ever happened in human history, I think it's important to evaluate that. Do we really think that that's right? Do we think it's true to that Israel is engaged in genocidal acts?
Yeah, and the point that you just made about how it's significant that the charge is being leveled against Israel when it's the very same crime that was suffered by the Jews is important in the strategy that I think it's using. I think it's an attempt to shame Israel because obviously lots of Jews live in Israel. They've long seen themselves as historical victims of a genocide. So if you can hang on them the very charge that they have otherwise seen themselves as being victims of, it's sort of an extra level of shame. And so therefore, all the more important that we examine it, particularly because it's so absurd. And I'll take the 2 points that you made, Tristan, and bring them together. One point you made was that Israel has experienced these charges of genocide over the course of a long history of war. And the second point you made was that the kind of paradigm case of genocide is the Holocaust. Now, let's think about that for a minute, because I can't emphasize enough that Israel's relationship with Palestinian Arabs in the region for decades has been defined by being constantly attacked or threatened by either local Arab regimes, whether Egypt or Jordan or Syria, or by subnational entities that occupy portions of them or occupy portions of the occupied territories, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There's a long history here. In previous podcasts, we'll share resources at the end. We've analyzed that history, made clear to the world that Israel's been the victim of these acts of aggression. And so if you consider that the major paradigm case of genocide has been the Holocaust, it's not like when Germany did to the Jews what it did. It was in somehow response to some Jewish invasion of Central Europe. And so that right there, the difference between the concrete situation of Israel and the concrete situation of Germany in the paradigm case of genocide, the fact that one was being invaded and one was not, that should already tell you why it's so absurd to apply this concept in the current context to Israel. But we should unpack this more, because we need to think about, like, what does this concept mean? Where does it come from? Why did people decide to form it in order to understand what was happening in Germany in the 1940s? And so we should definitely dig in further.
Yes, and one thing I would add, Ben, in addition to the fact that Israel has had to fight all of these wars of self-defense against constant aggression and constant threats that are ongoing, is the fact that has to be stressed as well, that Arabs living within Israel enjoy an unprecedented level of respect for their rights in the context of the Middle East, including the countries that have aggressed Israel. Not only in terms of gender expression, artistic expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, ability to participate in government, but also high levels of property rights and other economic rights that are not available to them in other places. Certainly in places like Jordan and Lebanon, where Palestinian Arabs are not allowed to own property.
Yeah, I mean, from that perspective, if Israel was trying for genocide, it's the worst, it's the lamest attempt at a genocide ever.
So let's, as you said, let's look at the concept of genocide. I think there's so much to unpack and think about in terms of, where does this term even come from? What's the history of it? And then our question also is this a valid concept? Is this a concept we should even be using? So the history of the term, let's just start with the person who coined the term and invented it. It was a scholar named Raphael Lemkin. And his goal was having survived the Holocaust, so his parents were murdered during the Holocaust, and he escaped to the United States. And one of his main goals was to create a new crime, to create a crime that you could charge Nazi leaders with and the architects of the final solution with during the Nuremberg trials. And he was involved in, you could say, a sort of legal activism during the Nuremberg trials to have a concept like genocide included and treated as a crime. And the way that he defined genocide and why he thought this was important was because he thought what genocide is it's the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups in biological, cultural, political, or economic terms. And he felt there are enough patterns that throughout history that show that this has happened. So for him, for example, key examples of it were the pogroms in Russia against Jews in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the massacre of Armenians in Turkey in 1915. And he felt there are enough patterns of this throughout history that we need a concept for this, and we need to make it a specific crime. One question you might wonder is like, well, why do you need to make it a specific crime? Isn't it already a crime, for example, to enslave or kill innocent people? Well, one of the things that Lemkin was motivated by was the idea that there's a specific form of injustice that happens when you destroy a group, and that it's actually worse than just killing an individual. So if you just kill an individual, the reasoning goes, or how he thought about it, you're ending a life, but you're not destroying a culture. And this is where I think there's a collectivistic framing that's built into how Lemkin thought about like why the concept of genocide is important, is that if you think that a culture or an ethnic group, and we'll talk about the concept of ethnicity in a moment, but if you think that a culture or an ethnic group is somehow more fundamental than an individual, and individuals depend on that for their existence, well, then destroying a cultural group is worse than killing individuals, because you're destroying what makes those individuals possible. And for Lemkin, he noted that there wasn't a framework in international law specifically to punish that, to punish the destruction of a culture. And his goal was to create a framework that would motivate the international community to intervene to prevent further genocides. As it in fact happened in history, in the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis were not charged with the crime of genocide. Actually, no state has ever been charged with the crime of genocide. Certain individuals have been, notably during the breakup of former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about even Lemkin's understanding of this concept, and where he has something valid to say and where there's something invalid to say, and we're going to try to distinguish those two from each other. We'll especially come back to the collectivist element that you mentioned in a moment. I think ultimately you can save the concept of genocide from that collectivism. There's a rational use of the term if you understand it the right way. But one thing I want to try to uncouple it from is this issue of international law. It's important to uncouple it, because if you're going to save the concept, you want to save it from the notion of international law, which I think is a basically meaningless concept. The best that you can interpret it to mean is the body of treaties that nations govern themselves by. If the United States signs a treaty with Great Britain, and the United States wants to abide by that treaty, then the terms of the treaty are a kind of international law. But it's entirely dependent on whether each party decides to actually abide by the treaty. And national entities are sovereign and can pull out of treaties anytime they want to. There's no international government that is going to enforce any kind of international law. And I don't think you can make sense of the idea of a law outside of the context of a government. There's the United Nations, but it is not a government. It has no enforcement mechanism. It is, in effect, a series of treaties which the various nations can abide by or not, and decide not to abide by all the time. So there's really not any meaning to the idea of international law. The most you could have for the only way I think something like genocide could ever be operative where the only place where a concept of genocide could be operative in an international context would be if, for example, the United States or the Allies go to war with Germany, they win the war, they occupy the country, and they decide they're going to impose their laws against genocide on Germany, punish the people who they think were responsible for it during World War II, which is, as you say, not something that actually happened. The Nuremberg trials were they were tried for other things besides that. So even if you could make sense of some way in which Israel were committing genocide, which I don't think you can, as we'll get to later, it wouldn't make sense to think of it as an international crime in international law, because there is just no international government to do the enforcing. And this is part of the reason why, even when these charges are filed against Israel by South Africa and the International Criminal Court, the most they can do is try to sanction certain Israeli leaders, so like they can't travel to Belgium without being arrested, and so all they have to do is not go to Belgium or whichever other countries the ICC has jurisdiction over. So it's a non-issue really, I think, to think of it as a form of crime. And if we can make sense of the concept of genocide, we need to uncouple it from that. So the big question is, can we make sense of the concept in some other terms?
Yeah, and we'll come back to the UN definition in a moment, because that's the one that people are now using as their reference point, or at least the people who make a more sophisticated argument that Israel is committing genocide. So we'll come back to that in a moment. And when we're thinking about, is it a valid concept, I think the people would naturally react, well, of course it's valid, because aren't there these historical patterns of, for example, there's the Holocaust, there's what's typically understood to be the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide. There's the Herero and Nama genocide by Germany in German Southwest Africa in the early 20th century. Aren't there historical patterns worth conceptualizing here? And I think the answer is yes. And if we're thinking, so let's set aside international law, there is a pattern worth conceptualizing of, there are groups that are hated for prejudicial reasons, targeted as such, and then they're eliminated, or there's an attempt to eliminate them entirely. And there are sociological reasons that you would want to conceptualize that way. There are historical reasons, anthropological reasons, insofar as they typically involve a lot of the same kinds of patterns. And I think this is part of what genocide studies, for example, investigates, is what are the ways that human beings have done this. So, for example, through forced movement, through forced sterilization, and so on. And so, if we're looking at specific cases, like in Armenia, the Armenian genocide, there was mass deportation of Armenian people. There were false claims made that the Armenians were a threat to the Turkish government. They marched people to their deaths in the desert. In Rwanda, there were false claims made about the dangers of the Tutsis and the fact that they were trying to overthrow Rwandan society. And there was a systemic, organized, basically door-to-door murder of every Tutsi in sight. in the Herero and Nama genocide, there was an explicit intention to eliminate the Herero and Nama people, considering them as a threat to the colonial domination of Germany. There was trapping people in the desert, poisoning water wells, and creating concentration camps where there was slave labor. So, and then of course the Holocaust as well involved a lot of these elements: forced displacement, slave labor, false claims of threats of Jews, and so you need a concept to cover this.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point that there are these historical patterns that have important similarities that make it worth conceptualizing. And I mean, you put it a moment ago as people will say, well, of course there's such a thing as genocide. And I think that's because people are often accustomed to, when they hear a new word, they think it's as good as any other word. But part of what you're raising here is the question of, well, is every brand new coining of a neologism that modern thinkers come up with, is it worth coining? And I think that is an important question, even when it turns out to be that the answer is yes. And here, I think we're both drawing on the idea that to have a valid concept, it's not enough that you have some superficial similarity among a bunch of cases, that there needs to be a deep similarity, something that you gain knowledge from by studying. And Tristan, you were pointing out how there were patterns of behavior here. So it's not just killing large numbers of people who happen to have, belong to what people take to be a racial group. But it's also forced sterilization, because here the idea is people think there's something important about a certain genetic lineage that needs to be eliminated, whether by killing or by sterilization or by working them to death. There's a connection among those kinds of behavior, and the thing that connects them is a certain kind of belief in the mind of the people who are doing the killing, which, in the example of racism, is a particularly evil belief. And so there's a pattern of behavior that is explained by a certain intention in the minds of the perpetrators, and that's a cluster of information that's worth conceptualizing. Now, the thing I should say about it is that if there's a valid concept here, it's probably not nearly well understood enough. And so, for example, you were talking about Lemkin, and I read Lemkin's original paper about this, and he categorizes a whole variety of different groups that one could imagine wanting to destroy. You mentioned national, religious, linguistic, racial, etc. I think one thing we'll have to talk about in a minute is, are all these groups real things? I think it's a variety of real or imagined things. Now, of course, the imagination still happens in the minds of perpetrators, and that's important. But if there is such a thing as a really terrible crime that involves wanting to extinguish a certain group of people, then it's also important that this crime is probably wider than many people have imagined, that it's not just committed by racists, for example, that it can also be committed, say, by communists. Who, when, for example, the Soviet Union decides that it wants to destroy the bourgeoisie, or that it wants to destroy the Ukrainian kulaks and starve them to death during the Holodomor, or when the Khmer Rouge decides that it wants to destroy the group of bourgeois intellectuals by basically turning them into slave labor in the countryside and by killing them when they're no longer useful, that counts as genocide too, even though it's not motivated by racism, because it is still a systematic pattern of extermination motivated by an irrational prejudice. Here, in this case, a prejudice against bourgeois intellectuals or against Ukrainian peasants. So I think there is a concept here, but it's often not understood. That's important then for understanding cases where it's not applied correctly.
Race is not a real thing. It's not a real phenomenon. People have demonstrated this scientifically, that you can find more similarity, but across a different so-called races genetically than within races and so on. So that scientifically, that concept, that idea has been refuted, but obviously people still have racist ideas, and they act on those ideas, and it's valid to have a concept of the kinds of things people will do based on those ideas. And as you said, Ben, oftentimes if we're just talking about the killing of groups in general, in the way that Lemkin thought about it, then it does need to be broader than race. But obviously, a lot of the paradigmatic examples people think about are ones that are based on race. And I think a parallel here would be something like witch hunting, where and witch hunts, where you have a false or prejudicial concept of a certain group of people. So perhaps women that engage in non-traditional healing methods, or are outcasted from their community, or something like that. And you ascribe to them uh, qualities or properties that they don't in fact have, such as being satanic, and you target them and kill them on that basis. That's essentially something like what's happening with genocide, but perhaps on a different kind of scale. But I think the way to conceptualize it is similar to how we would think about something like a witch hunt.
Yeah, I take it what you're saying is that if you take the Lemkin view straight, that there are these groups and wanting to destroy them is the crime, then there are real questions you can ask about the core validity of the concept, because you're saying, well, there's legitimate questions, just like you can ask about whether the concept of genocide is valid. You can ask a question about, well, are the concepts of these kinds of groups valid? Are there really races in the way that there are, let's say, species? Or are they, closer to just extended families, where extended families aren't, biologically distinct from each other, where we all ultimately are descended from the same ancestors? That's the reason why scientists think that there's questions about whether the concepts of the races are meaningful, and I share their skepticism toward it. So then, if there are no races, can you say that there's some kind of crime or some kind of evil involved in wanting to destroy the groups that aren't really real? And I think the point is, well, there's certainly evil in killing the individuals who are members of these groups, and the fact that people conceptualize them as groups, even if they're not real groups, is sort of immaterial to the fact that there's evil there. Just like there aren't any witches, but there's something evil about witch hunting. And so there can be a valid concept of witch hunting, just like there can be a valid concept of genocide. I think that's right. And talking about the kind of unreality of the groups in question, the idea that there are distinct races and that they're a group, there's a life to the group of its own. That's the collectivist point that you had wanted to say more about, the way in which it kind of infiltrates Lemkin's understanding of genocide, and we should say more about that.
Yeah, there's a really insightful interview between Ezra Klein and Philip Sands that Ezra Klein recently had. Philip Sands is a scholar and a legal expert on genocide, and really what a lot of people, so in addition, I talked about the association with the Holocaust. There's this sense that the crime of genocide, thought of in Lemkin's way, is the crime of crimes. There's nothing worse than killing a group of people. There's nothing worse than trying to eliminate an ethnicity, trying to eliminate a race. And I think that's where you can see the problematic kind of collectivism that is built into how people think about the concept.
Yeah, and if you're somebody who thinks that something like a racial group is a biologically real group, a kind of organism of its own, it sort of makes sense why you would think there's a special crime involved in killing it, just like you might think there's a special crime if you think that if you cause the extinction of a species, which is a whole separate conversation. But in fact, they're not. In fact, they're not like an organism that you can kill by itself. And so there can't be anything specially wrong about it, importantly, apart from the killing of the individuals involved in that group. And this is a good place for me to share a quotation I often think about when I think about what is problematic about kind of elevating genocide above all other forms of evil. There's certainly evil there, but is it worse than all the other kinds? in an essay called The Roots of War, Ayn Rand was writing about the threat posed by nuclear weapons and the role that governments have in posing these threats. And she wrote the following. Now, part of it is not about genocide, but you'll see the part that applies. She says, "It's true that nuclear weapons have made wars too horrible to contemplate. But it makes no difference to a man whether he is killed by a nuclear bomb or a dynamite bomb or an old-fashioned club. Nor does the number of other victims or the scale of destruction make any difference to him. And there is something obscene in the attitude of those who regard horror as a matter of numbers, who are willing to send a small group of youths to die for the tribe, but scream against the danger to the tribe itself, and more, who are willing to condone the slaughter of defenseless victims, but march in protest against wars between the well-armed." And so, before I say more, let me repeat that I think a willingness to kill people systematically for racist or any other kinds of irrational reasons certainly makes you evil. And I think it makes you more evil than somebody who, let's say, commits a crime just on the spur of the moment, a crime of passion. They lose their temper, they react rashly. So there's a difference between, in fact, first degree and second or third degree murder. And so the kinds of things that people point to when they talk about genocide are certainly relevant to assigning someone as having committed, first degree as opposed to other forms of murder. That evil intent to destroy a whole group of people is relevant for understanding what's wrong there. At the same time, it's not at all obvious, at least to me, why Hitler, as someone who commits genocide because he wants to extinguish what he takes to be a distinct race of people, why he is more evil than, let's say, a serial killer who has whatever crazy motivations he has. A serial killer who wants to target, blonde prostitutes in California. I mean, that's just as evil from the perspective of the victims as the evil of Hitler. And again, it's because there's no one to whom that evil is going to matter besides the victims and, their relatives or the people who know them, besides the individuals who are actually affected by the crime. There's no racial organism that has a kind of racial consciousness which is rendered extinct by a successful genocide. And I mean, here's one way of thinking about it. I think a race, what people think races are, is in effect large families of people who are, you share descent from. And, there's no special crime with the extinction of a family, the kind that we understand. Like, so if I'm the last member of the bear family, and somebody kills me, or if I just don't reproduce and the family line doesn't go on, it's not like there's some terrible pain or evil being suffered by the bear family entity. And it's the same way with what people think about races. So the evil is in the destruction and the death and the suffering of the individuals who are thought of as being a member of this larger group.
Yeah, I think that's what you've said, Ben, is very interesting and important as far as how people imbue a certain kind of importance to genocide and a certain kind of they think of it as a worse injustice than just what's done against individuals as such. I think it's worth turning back to the UN definition of genocide. And now that we've kind of stated what are some of the problems with it, but what might be a rational version of the concept of genocide. So the ICC, and this, by the way, comes from the Genocide Convention of in 1948, which was later updated in the Rome Statute, which is what the International Criminal Court uses. So according to the Article 6 of the Rome Statute, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And just to repeat, any of the following acts: 1, killing members of the group; 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group; 3, deliberately inflicting living conditions intended to destroy the group physically in whole or in part, such as starvation or deprivation of medical care; 4, imposition of measures intended to prevent births within the group; 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So I think we've already said a lot about why this kind of definition is going to be really problematic. One is that the definition used by the ICC seems to imply the reality of ethnical or racial groups. But an even bigger problem is that it doesn't address why the killing of members of a group is happening. And it's because of that, it's far too broad and ambiguous to be useful if you're trying to think of it as a crime. Now, we've already talked about there's not really a logical or rational basis for international law. There's no enforcement mechanism for international law. But even if you're just thinking of this as a moral issue, as okay, this is something that's morally wrong, this is a kind of injustice that happens, you can't have it built into it that it's ambiguous, like why the killing of members of a group is happening. Because, for example, in the context of a just war of self-defense, for instance, it's often going to be the case that you have to kill members of a national group. It's going to have to be the case that you cause serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group, to inflict difficult living conditions on members of that group. If we're defining genocide as, well, you're just killing members of a group and it's ambiguous why you're doing it, is that justified or not? Is it based on prejudice or not? Is it based on a military goal that's justified? Then your whole category is going to package together just and unjust actions, and it's not going to be a useful concept.
Yeah, I think there's so much wrong with the UN version of this definition. I mean, there's problems already with Lemkin's, but this like doubles down on the problems, as you've mentioned. Because you're bombing, the German fortifications on Normandy during D-Day. Well, the German soldiers who were part of that fortification are part of the national group of Germany. And so, like, by this definition, any kind of war of self-defense on any terms and any circumstances would count as genocide if the soldiers are part of a national group. And so that's just ridiculous, the way this definition. And so, like, if this is the definition that's being used against Israel, no wonder it's easy to count what they're doing as genocide, because this definition can count just about anything anybody does as genocide. I'll just give a few more examples. The fact that the definition includes not just bodily, but mental harm perpetrated against a part of a group. So, like, if I make a really good argument against Catholicism, because I think it's a ridiculous religion and I wish people would all deconvert from it and the Catholic Church should disestablish itself, and I succeed in part by causing mental harm to some Catholics who then decide something's wrong with Catholicism and then they stop being Catholics because of it, I'm committing genocide by this definition, because I've persuaded someone to drop a religion, not all of them even, just some part. So these are massively disparate phenomena. These have nothing to do with the Holocaust. They have nothing to do in intent, in consequence. This is a worthless definition. And so, there were seeds of confusion in Lemkin's concept that this draws on and now multiplies. And so, yeah, is it any wonder that Israel is able to be accused of genocide if a concept as incoherent as this is what's now at work in the minds of the accusers?
Yeah, and I just want to say a couple more things so that it doesn't come across that we're straw manning the definition, because so the UN definition, what people I think would say in response to some of the things that you've said is, well, that's why you have the as such clause, is, well, if you're because it is meant to exclude armed conflict, but that just pushes the question back, right? Because okay, so you're fighting German soldiers, but if the nation of Germany is against you, if the whole nation is working to destroy you, what is the relevant distinction between the people that are working to, manufacture the guns, manufacture the bullets, to provide food for the soldiers that are then going to kill you, and the soldiers themselves? There's not a relevant moral difference between that when the nation of people are against you. And so I think part of what you're bringing out, Ben, is that it makes it impossible to think about how you would actually fight a just war, and how you would evaluate a just war and evaluate who your actual enemy is.
Yeah, but I even leave aside questions about your intent to destroy the nation. I really don't like Catholics. I think Catholics, I used to be one. I'd like them all to convert to atheists. I would like to end the Catholic Church as such by convincing people that this is a ridiculous system of beliefs. So the as such applies to me. I don't think I'm actually committing genocide.
And certainly in the case of, for example, to take another example that's highly relevant, certainly in the case of Islam, for a large percentage of Muslims, indeed, probably a majority of Muslims, a criticism of the Quran, a mockery of Muhammad, is an extremely serious crime and a serious threat to them. And then, so are we supposed to think then, well, that's causing serious mental harm to members of that group? So I think that would be another example of how just utterly absurd this concept is. And I think when we think about, given the problems with this conceptualization of genocide, given the inherent problems of ambiguity, the problems of collectivistic framing, it should make us pause in terms of thinking about the claims of specific scholars of genocide, what they're actually claiming, and are they actually in a position to evaluate whether what is happening is Israel, which we'll get to in a moment, the direct evaluation of claims that are being made against Israel. Are they even in a position to think rationally about whether this would be a genocide or not? And again, this is not to say that you couldn't have a rational concept of genocide, of how you would prevent them, how they happen, what's the sociology of them. But given that the current way that people think about it has all of these problematic framings, I think it should raise a serious question of, can scholars who adopt that definition be even in a position to rationally evaluate a specific case like what's happening in Israel?
Yeah, this is the kind of question where having a clear, rational definition is essential. And if you don't have that, you're playing with language. And I think that's what's happening in that scholarly field. So let's turn to the main question. Let's turn to the question about whether a rationally defined concept of genocide could possibly apply to what's happening in Israel with Gaza. And I think the answer is no. I think if genocide means anything at all, if you can give a rational definition of it, what it means is something like the intentional attempt to destroy a hated group for prejudicial reasons. And just all of the evidence that we have, some of which you've already mentioned, Tristan, like you mentioned the fact that Arab Israelis are citizens and have full rights in Israel. All of that evidence, I think, demonstrates that Israel has no such intent. It doesn't want to destroy every Arab. Many of them are citizens. It doesn't even want to destroy every Arab who thinks of himself as a Palestinian. I mean, all the Palestinians on the West Bank think of themselves that way. And there's no war being fought on the West Bank right now. It's just against Gaza. So there is something that Israel wants to destroy Hamas. That is the intent of their war. And now you might still think that there's something unjust about that war. You might think that they are persecuting it irrationally or in an unjustified way. That's a separate conversation we can have. I will argue with you about that. I'll disagree that it's basically an unjust war. But even if you thought it was an unjust war, it still wouldn't mean it was genocide, just for that fact. Because to have this rational definition requires something about the intent of the perpetrator here. And there's just every reason in the world to think that that is not Israel's intent.
Yeah, and when we look at specific claims made by specific scholars, you see the kinds of problems that we've brought out in the concept play out in real time. So, for example, you have claims from Amnesty International that what their evidence is, or what constitutes a sufficient reason to believe that there's genocide happening in Gaza, is the destruction of Gaza, the destruction of all the buildings in Gaza, and the forced displacement of Gaza. But there's no consideration of, is that serving a military goal? Is that part of a justified war of self-defense? Is that part of a pattern that's happening against Arabs everywhere, that Israel is trying to eliminate the possibility of Arabs living? As you just said, there are Arabs that have full rights in Israel, so that's clearly not the case. And but again, if you think of if you define genocide as, well, you're destroying part of a group and it doesn't matter why you're destroying them, or you're making it harder for them to live, or you're causing serious bodily harm to them, and there's no part of the definition of, are you doing it for prejudicial reasons? Are you doing it for irrational reasons? Then you're going to be led to the conclusion that this is genocide. But as we pointed out, if there are military justifications for that, which I think there are, given that Hamas has embedded itself in the civilian population, is not surrendering, and has expressly themselves expressed a genocidal intent against Israel that they're prepared to act on again and again, well, the threat hasn't been eliminated yet, and you need to eliminate the threat. And the military actions that the IDF takes in order to pursue that cannot be considered as prejudicial in this context. Again, we might, and obviously there might be military experts who might disagree on specific methods. You might dispute certain approaches, but all of that has to be separate from the claim of, is this prejudicial and based on an intention to prejudicially eliminate Palestinians as a whole, as an ethnic group or a racial group. And I think the same kind of point happens when we think about, people often claim that there's a disproportionality. And I think the idea of proportionate warfare relates to this point, insofar as what is often claimed is that you have an obligation to protect enemy non-combatants, and that part of fighting a proportionate war is that you don't harm enemy non-combatants. But what that effectively means is that you're not taking all of the steps necessary to eliminate the force that's against you and to act in your self-defense. And insofar as what a just war is that you're doing what's necessary to eliminate force and return to civilization, return to a situation where people can live peacefully. You need to do whatever is necessary to eliminate the force. And so the whole idea of disproportionality that's used as a justification of the intent to genocide is itself irrational, and is in effect demanding on Israel's part that they do not act in their own self-defense, that they aid Hamas in terms of, for example, providing humanitarian aid to Gaza, providing electricity, fuel, and essentially helping them continue to exist.
Yeah, I think the respect in which critics of Israel describe what they're doing as disproportionate, as targeting civilians, certainly are not thinking about the military reasons for this, as opposed to some kind of racist reason for wanting to destroy an alleged race or some such thing. But of course, it's also relevant to point out that Israel takes unprecedented measures to prevent the killing of civilians. It tells them to move from one part of Gaza to another to avoid the latest military targeting. And I mention that not because I want to say that is the proper thing for them to be doing. I'll say something about that in a moment. But at the very least, it certainly shows they don't have an intent to even extinguish the Gazan population of Palestinians. If for whatever reason you thought that was the relevant group that made it evidence of genocidal intent, they don't have it because they regularly shuffle the Gazans around trying to save them. And so, like I said before, with regard to the Israeli Arab citizens, if this is genocide, it's the lamest genocide ever. They're just not very good at carrying out their intent, and that's just not too likely, given all the other things that Israel's very good at doing. So it's clearly not their intent, and therefore it's clearly not genocide. Now, like I said before, I say that not to endorse necessarily what Israel is doing, because Tristan, you talked about what it means to have a just war, as it's a war of self-defense. And if you have the right to exist, you therefore have the right to maintain your existence even if someone's trying to destroy you. And you have the right to muster the resources necessary to do that. And that means, unfortunately, in wartime, it means killing people. And like I said, you might still think that what Israel's doing is unjust. That doesn't make it genocide. But now I'll mention the reasons why I would disagree with you if you thought this meant it was unjust. Because it is a fallacy of modern moral thinking to believe that civilians, simply for the fact of being civilians, gain some kind of special moral status just for that fact, therefore making them immune from death in war. And like one thing to mention in modern warfare involving groups like Hamas is that it's just practically impossible to distinguish between actual civilians and Hamas fighters, because Hamas fighters don't wear uniforms, don't follow any of the conventions associated with war, don't believe in the Geneva Convention for all kinds of reasons. So already you've got a practical problem. But in fact, there are many civilians who support the aggressor. In this case, many civilians in Gaza who actually voted for Hamas, who are intellectually and morally supportive of their efforts, and certainly don't gain any moral protection because of that. They're actually morally responsible, some of them, for the existence of Hamas. Even those who object to Hamas are still, in many ways, part of the war machine. They're used by Hamas. They're used for cover. They're used for protection. They're used for material resources. And they might not be morally responsible for what Hamas is doing, but they certainly play a causal role in what Hamas is doing. And sometimes that means that they get in the way when a country like Israel, which is fighting in self-defense, is trying to defend itself against that aggressor. And yes, I think it's true that innocent people die in war. They're certainly dying in Gaza. And it's certainly a tragedy, and it's certainly an outrage. But in that kind of situation, what you have to do is think about who is morally responsible for that outrage. And the person who's responsible, the party who's responsible, is the aggressor, is the one who started the unjust war against whom the victim has the right to defend itself. In this case, that means Hamas. And that means that any innocent deaths, outrageous and tragic as they may be in Gaza, of which there are many, the fault lies entirely with Hamas. And it's Hamas that should give up. It's Hamas that should surrender if anyone wants those innocents to be protected in the future. In any case, that's a sidebar. The fact that Israel does sometimes defer to civilians as though they have a moral status, which I don't think they should be seen as having, though, that's certainly evidence that they don't have this genocidal intent. If they do, it's the lamest genocide ever.
Yeah, and it's relevant that to that point that the safe zones are actually quite effective in reducing casualties. So there's only about 1.2 casualties occurring in those zones, and there's several military experts that have made this claim. So people from West Point, the British Colonel Richard Kemp, General Martin Dempsey, that have claimed that the IDF's caution is unprecedented in urban warfare, and that those kind of statistics bear out if you look at and compare, for example, the invasion of Iraq and how many civilians died as part of that invasion. But I think if we're thinking about what's tragic about this, there's clearly the tragedy. What's actually tragic about this? There's clearly the tragedy of this war is totally unnecessary, and Hamas has imposed untold suffering and untold destruction for an insane fanatical reason on its own people. And that's what's relevant here to think about, is that it's part of their strategy. And this is part of what makes the claims of genocide even tragic as well, because it's exactly what Hamas wants, is to portray Israel as an aggressor, to portray Israel as a colonizer, as an oppressor, which masks the genocidal intent of Hamas themselves, which are clearly to destroy Israel. And for Hamas, putting their civilian population in Gaza in harm's way is actually evidence of the fact that Israel's intention is not to commit genocide, because Hamas knows that Israel does not want to kill every single person in Gaza. Otherwise, that strategy would not be effective. It would not be effective to hide among the civilian population if Israel didn't care about the differences between civilians and combatants. Obviously, as you said, Ben, Israel, if you have questions about the justice of that, it should be in the direction of questioning why Israel goes out of its way to protect non-combatants. But certainly it's evidence, conclusive evidence, I think, that Israel is not committing genocide.
Yeah, let me double down on something you just said, which you pointed out that if anybody has genocidal intent here, it's Hamas. And that's clear. Like, they repeatedly have announced to the world their intent to destroy the nation of Israel and kill all Jews. So if there's someone who's committing genocide here, it's Hamas. And the doubling down point is, as you said, they're the ones who are intentionally putting the innocent civilians in Gaza in harm's way. And their whole way of life and their whole ideology is a form of death worship. They welcome death. This is part of the reason that they venerate suicide bombers. And so if you thought that the Arab Palestinians living in Gaza constituted the kind of group, the intention to destroy which actually counted as genocide, if anybody's committing genocide in Gaza here, it's Hamas. And so it's not just Israel that they want to destroy. They don't care about wiping out their very own people. And the accusation that Israel is the one that wants to commit genocide is the supreme smoke job, in the supreme smoke screen intended to obscure the fact that the genocide is really coming from the chambers of Hamas. And if there's any injustice involved in Israel's war, It's the fact that they hamper themselves and restrain themselves as much as they do by giving as much deference to civilian population as they do, when they have an absolute right to defend themselves and to eliminate their killers, which means Hamas.
So let's end here. And there are some resources that I think are worth considering to learn more about the topic that we've discussed. There's Alain Journo's book, What Justice Demands, which is a very interesting and morally powerful exploration of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Alain Journo and Nikos did a podcast a couple of years ago, right after October 7th, entitled Did Israel Steal Palestinian Land? And explores some of the fallacies engaged by opponents of Israel on the nature of the conflict as well. And then, Ben, there's also your essay, We Ignore the Unconditional Right to Self-Defense at Our Peril, that you also published a couple of years ago. So we would recommend all of those resources as opportunities for further thoughts about the topic. And please subscribe, comment, and share on YouTube and Facebook, and send comments and questions to newideal@aynrand.org. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Tristan.